Well, welcome. We are going to narrow down our focus this evening. So far we've been talking about the New Testament in general. The first evening we looked at the organization of the New Testament, the canon, the fact that it has 27 books, how it's organized, historical books, epistles, apocryphal books, etc. Apocalyptic books. Last time we looked at the history of New Testament times, which involves all of the books. But tonight we're going to narrow our focus specifically to the first three books of the New Testament. We know that the first four books of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why am I going to narrow myself to the first three instead of the first four? Well, the first three have a lot in common, and they differ a lot from the Gospel of John. In 1758, a scholar, for the first time in history, printed the four Gospels, not one after the other, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He printed all four of them simultaneously in four columns. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And he lined up the episodes that they had in common, and he left blanks where one gospel would have some episode that the other didn't include, and so on. The name that he gave to this was synopsis. We normally think of a synopsis as being a summary, a condensation of, a concise statement of. He wasn't using it in that sense. He was using it more fundamentally in the sense of the two Greek words. Sun means with, and opsis, like optic or telescope, has to do with seeing. So he called his book a synopsis because it was a seeing of each of the Gospels with the others in this columnar format. What immediately became apparent to everybody, for the first time in history, was just how similar the first three Gospels are, and just how drastically they differed from the fourth Gospel. So much so that it became common, soon after the publication, to refer to the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as the Synoptic Gospels. They are the ones that you can easily see with each other, as opposed to John. So what were some of the ways in which the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were seen to be different from the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John? Well, let's list some of these differences for you. And these are differences that anybody can notice if they sit down and examine the four Gospels carefully. One difference is the structure of the Gospels. According to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus, toward the beginning of the Gospel, pretty early book, begins a public ministry. He spends several months preaching and teaching and healing up in Galilee, the northern part of the Holy Land. And then he travels down to the south, where he goes to Jerusalem, preaches and does miracles for a week, Holy Week, and then he's executed. Consequently, the Synoptics all posit a 1-year public ministry. John is different. If you read John's Gospel, we're told that near the beginning, Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover. Near the middle, Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover, and at the end, Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover. Well, this hypothesizes at least a 2-year, and most would say a 3-year public ministry. From the time he was baptized until the time he was crucified, Jesus spent 3 years roaming the countryside, preaching and healing and so on. So there's one major difference between the Synoptics and John. Another difference is the organization of the Synoptics and John. According to the Synoptics, let's just take one example. The cleansing of the temple. Cleansing of the temple is the traditional name for that episode where Jesus went into the temple, saw the money changers selling fishes and so on, and exchanging currencies, became upset, made a whip of cords, overturned the money changers' tables, and got the animals and the money changers out of the temple. This act is referred to as the cleansing of the temple. When did Jesus do that during his career? 12, he was in the temple, but that was when he was discussing things with the rabbis. Most of us think of it as being at the end of his ministry, during Holy Week. In fact, it's one of the precipitating events that finally prompts the authorities to do away with Jesus. And sure enough, 3 out of 4 Gospels have the cleansing of the temple at the end of his public ministry. You look at John's Gospel, it's right there at the beginning. In fact, it's the very first thing Jesus does as a public figure. And then for 3 years, he wanders about the countryside and so on. So really, this has no effect on precipitating the crisis. Now, I use that one only as an example to indicate that the order of events is very different in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and in John's Gospel. Another major difference how Jesus speaks. If you read, let's say, Matthew's Gospel, you'll find Jesus saying things like the parable of the houses on rock and sand, the one about the laborers in the vineyard, the 2 sons, the one about the weeds that is sown in among the weeds, and so on. Same with Mark, same with Luke. Jesus frequently speaks in parables. In fact, if you count up the parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll either discover that there are 30 or there are 60. Because there's 30 fairly long ones that take about a paragraph each. Prodigal son, Good Samaritan, that kind of thing. And then there's 30 more that are only a couple of sentences long. Like the lost sheep only takes a couple of sentences. So depending upon how long you demand a passage to be before you call it a parable, they'll either say 30 or 60. We'll go with the 60. Lost sheep and so on are still parables as far as I can see. So we have 60 parables in the Synoptic. How many parables does Jesus say in John's Gospel? 0. No parables in John's Gospel. You have an occasional figure of speech. You have an occasional metaphor, like, I am the vine, you are the branches. But that's not really a parable. There's no little story involved. Consequently, 60 parables in the Synoptic versus 0 in John. Now, the other major way that Jesus speaks in the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, besides parables, is proverbs. The technical term that's used in biblical scholarship is aphorism. Which is just a synonym for proverb. But all of these short, one-sentence, clever sayings that Jesus makes are called aphorism. An example would be, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. That's a clever single sentence, proverb-like saying. That's what we mean by aphorism. And there's lots of aphorisms of Jesus in the first three Gospels. In fact, one scholar did a major study on the aphorisms about 15, 20 years ago. He wound up finding 133 of them. How many aphorisms in John's Gospel? Well, it's a little tricky because exactly where you draw the line, it's a little hard to say. But there's hardly any, if at all, aphorisms in John's Gospel. Almost none, if none. So does this mean Jesus doesn't speak ever in John's Gospel? If he doesn't say parables and he doesn't say proverbs, aphorisms, what does he say? Well, he does talk. In fact, Jesus talks much more in John's Gospel than he does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just that he does not speak in that style of parables and proverbs. Instead, what you get, instead of parables and aphorisms, are what are called revelatory discourses. Revelatory discourses. John's Gospel is structured so that Jesus will do a miracle. Let's say he heals a blind man. And then somebody will ask him about it. And that's all that Jesus needs to start off on a long speech. The speech can go for a full chapter. It's basically a monologue. Occasionally you'll have the person ask a little question or something, but it's never more than a slight interruption. Essentially, these are long monologues by Jesus. That's what you get in John's Gospel. And these are also, may I say, rather rambling discourses. They don't all stick to a single subject. They usually don't relate directly to whatever miracle just got asked about. It's like Jesus is sort of musing by himself and not making much effort to relate what he says to the specific context that he's in the narrative. So you have these long, rambling discourses. I don't want to take time to look at one, but if you want an example, take a look at what Jesus says after Nicodemus comes to him. Nicodemus was a Pharisee who came to him at night because he was worried about the other Pharisees. And asked him some questions about baptism, and then Jesus sort of starts with baptism, but then he sort of wanders off into all kinds of other stuff. So take a look at that one. That's a good example of a revelatory discourse. I mentioned miracles. We know that Jesus did lots of miracles. He would heal people who had physical infirmities, like a blind person. Those were certainly miracles. He would intervene in nature. That's much rarer. But there's a handful, like stilling the storm or walking on water. Plus, he would also exorcise people who had demons. He did a lot of exorcisms. If you count up all of the miracles that Jesus did in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I'll include exorcisms here because I think that's supernatural intervention in creation, which is a miracle. If we count up all the miracles in the Synoptics, how many can we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Well, give or take how you add them up, but a couple of books I've looked at tend to say around 43. How many miracles in John's Gospel? Exactly 7. Exactly 7. And in every case, they are the excuse or the occasion for a long discourse by Jesus that follows them. All 7 occur in the first half of John's Gospel. John's Gospel is usually organized into into two sections. The first half is chapters 1 to 13, and that's called the Book of Signs. It's called the Book of Signs because this is where you find those 7 miracles, which are sort of the backbone of the first half of John's Gospel. Everything else hangs from those. The second half, which is chapters 14 to 21, is called the Book of Glory. Because this is where you find Jesus glorified. The entire second half of John's Gospel is the Passion and Resurrection narratives. They occupy an enormous proportion of the book. By contrast, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Passion narrative is near the end and only occupies maybe 20% of the book. There's another big difference between John and this history.
I was just going to say, doesn't the number 7 special?
I would assume so. A number for protection, something like that. Combination of square and triangle, 4 plus 3 sides, something like that. But I don't know for sure, and certainly nothing's ever said explicitly in John's Gospel to indicate. But yeah, that's probably just
read some of the, I remember reading Revelation.
Yeah, good point, yeah. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, all that. Yeah, I'm sure there's some significance like that. Okay, now we could go on. There are other differences. The date of the Last Supper differs between the Synoptics and John and so on. But let's stop here. This is sufficient, I think, to indicate that John's Gospel is rather drastically different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When this synopsis was published in 1778, a couple of years after the American Revolution, it forced everybody to notice those differences. And so everybody had to make a choice. You either had to say that John got it right, and his is the basically historical gospel, tells how it really happened, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. Or Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the basically historical gospels. They tell basically how it really happened, and John didn't get it right. They can't be both because they contradict, as we've seen. Well, to begin with, a lot of scholars opted for John, in part because John is a very popular gospel, understandably. It's a wonderful book. But gradually, over the decades, into the 1800s, most scholars came to realize, as they studied the problem closer, it just won't work. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be more historical than John's gospel. Now, this raised a larger question. Okay, suppose we set John aside and we concentrate on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. To what extent are they historical? To what extent do they tell us what really happened back there? Or are they also playing fast and loose with the historical facts? So what becomes initiated in the early 1800s is something you've probably heard of, the quest for the historical Jesus. That's a famous title of the book that was published in 1907 by Albert Schweitzer in Germany. He summarized all of this historical research on the Gospels that was done throughout the 1800s. The quest for the historical Jesus became a dominant passion for New Testament scholars. Let's look at the Gospels, in particular the Synoptic Gospels, the way that we would any other ancient manuscript, and assess it by historical criteria the way we would any other historical book, and try to determine as best we can exactly what actually happened. Well, as scholars began on this question of historical Jesus, one thing that they noticed right away was, even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be very similar to each other, when you compare them with John, it makes Matthew, Mark, and Luke look real similar. But when you forget about John and you just look at Matthew, Mark, and doggone it, it turns out that there's a heck of a lot of differences right there between them. Now, these are nowhere near the drastic differences that occur with John's Gospel, but they certainly exist. I should say one more thing about John's Gospel before we leave it behind. Why is it that John's Gospel does not present events in the same order as the Synoptics, or have miracles the way the Synoptics does, or have parables and aphorisms like the Synoptics? Well, my guess is, and a lot of scholars have said this, it's not just my idea, John's Gospel is not intended to present what actually happened. That was not its purpose. If you go in a Christian bookstore nowadays, here in Houston, you'll find that there are different walls have different types of books on them. Way back here in the back, you'll find all the Bibles. And over here on this wall, you'll find all the highfalutin theology books. Over on this wall, you'll find the devotional literature. Things like My Daily Bread, or The Upper Room, that sort of thing I'm talking about. Name one. Can I take one of these?
In Conversation with God.
Sure. Or My Utmost for His Highest. These sorts of books.
Streams in the Desert.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Now, the purpose of those books is not the same as the theology books over here. Some of these theology books may be about searching for the historical Jesus or something like that. They're after history. The devotional literature is not trying to tell you what actually happened. It's trying to get you closer to God in your faith. I think that John's Gospel is devotional literature. I think what we have in John's Gospel is not a presentation of what Jesus actually did and actually said. That's not the point. It is speeches put into Jesus' mouth in order to help us be closer to God. These are meditations on Jesus by the author of the book. And the author chose to present these meditations about Jesus using as a literary device or format a gospel type of narrative. So, the Gospel of John is meditations on Christ. But they are presented as being put into the mouth of Jesus. That's why John's Gospel is so drastically different from Matthew and Luke. It has a different purpose. Well, back to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When you restrict your attention to them, you still discover that there are a lot of differences between them. Let me take as an example the Christmas stories. We're all familiar with the Christmas stories because we all send and receive Hallmark cards every Christmas. We know what's on the cover of those cards. Let's just list real quickly some of the details that you can remember concerning the Christmas story. The star. Good. Excuse me. The census. What else do you remember? The Magi. And the manger. Oh, good one. In fact, we get the story about John the Baptist. An angel showed up to John the Baptist's dad and said, your wife Elizabeth is going to have a baby. He said, oh, Shaw. That's a paraphrase, but it's and the angel said, all right, you're mute until the baby is born. So he's mute until the baby is born, and there was a visit, right? Mary went to visit Elizabeth because they were cousins. And when Mary showed up, John, inside the womb of Elizabeth, leapt for joy. So there's several details here. You have Zechariah the father struck mute. You have the visitation of Elizabeth by Mary, you have the birth of John the Baptist. Good. What else do you remember from the Christmas story? The Annunciation. Now that was where Gabriel appeared to Mary and said, "Do not be afraid. The child in your womb is the result of the Holy Spirit." And her response was, "Let it be done to me according to your will." So that's the Annunciation. But actually, if you remember, there's also an Annunciation to Joseph. Shortly after he learns that his girlfriend is pregnant, Joseph is sleeping one night, and an angel appears to him in a dream. And the angel says, "Do not let it trouble you. Do not divorce her." He was thinking he would clear her away quietly. He still loved her, didn't want to hurt her. Because she is with child through the Holy Spirit. That's an Annunciation. It's not nearly as well known, but it is there in the Christmas story. What else? Good. Slaughter the innocents. Now that was something that happened because the Magi showed up at Herod's court and said, "We know that the new king of the Jews has been born. Where is he? Where is he?" Herod scratched his head and said, "No, there was one, but this is very interesting." So he asked his advisors. They told him in Bethlehem, because in Micah chapter 3, there's a prophecy that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. So then he sent soldiers there to kill all children under the age of, all male children under the age of 2. That's the slaughter of the innocents. We still celebrate a feast in their honor every year. It's on December 28th, beginning of Christmas. But how come Jesus didn't get killed?
They went to Egypt.
The flight into Egypt. Remember that? Joseph is warned in a dream, and so you get the flight into Egypt. And then later on, after word is received in Egypt that Herod has died, then he brings them back. And they return to Nazareth. What about the shepherds? Weren't there shepherds on the... keeping watch? And while they're out there, angels, the sky opens up, clouds open up, and there's an angelic voice above. What do they sing? Anybody remember? Lord God in the highest, peace to his people on earth. Not Lord God and the King. We added that later. That's it. Peace to his people on earth. So we get the angelic choir. We could go on probably and think of some other. Oh, I just thought of a couple more. One of those 2 old people. 8 days after his birth, he was taken to the temple to be presented.
Simeon and Anna.
Yeah, Simeon and Anna. And they both make some kind of a prophetic statement over the child. Like Simeon says to Mary, "He will be a sword through your heart, and he will be a sign of contradiction." Etc. I'm sure we could add other things up there. But this will suffice. This will suffice to demonstrate what I said before we started this exercise. That Matthew, Mark, and Luke are surprisingly different when you sit down and really look at them. Because I have deliberately made 2 columns here. The only place that you find Christmas stories, scholars usually call them infancy narratives, the only place that you'll find infancy narratives are in 2 of the 4 Gospels. Matthew has them and Luke has them. The infancy narratives are Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and Luke chapters 1 and 2. You don't have them in Mark and you don't have them in John. And when you look at them, it turns out that all of these details appear in Matthew's infancy narrative. no magi, no star, no slaughter of the innocents, etc. in Luke's version. And there is no birth of John the Baptist, Elizabeth, Zechariah, no Annunciation of Mary, no shepherds and angels in Matthew's version. We tend to combine all this in our heads, understandably, but when you sit down and look, it turns out that there's actually two quite different narratives of Jesus' birth. This is not to say that there are not some crucial and very important similarities between the two. Both of them have some kind of outsiders who worship. Both of them have, by the way, we didn't put it up here, but according to Luke, Jesus is born in a cave, not in a manger. Both of them have Jesus born out where he ought to be born, among the marginalized people, the poor people at the edges of fringes of society. Both of them have annunciations. Both of them have celestial signs, star or angelic choir. Both of them have the birth in Bethlehem. You could have that up here in both columns, Bethlehem. And both of them have a virgin birth. Both of them assert that Mary was a virgin, which gave birth. So there are important similarities too. I don't mean to totally obscure those, but at the moment we're concentrating on the differences. Obviously something's going on here. Why is it that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar and yet so different? You know what I just did? I just gave you the definition for the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. The synoptic problem exercised European scholarship as one of the major topics for discussion, alongside evolution and a few others. This is one of the main topics that European scholars discussed all throughout the 1800s. And the definition for the synoptic problem is, why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar and yet so different? How are we to explain how they have wound up in the condition that they're in presently in our Bibles? Why are they so different? Why are they so similar and yet so different? That is the synoptic problem. Yes?
Does that discredit the authenticity of the Bible in any way? The fact that they're different?
This is a very extremely important issue, but it's one that we discussed in the previous series of lectures on the Old Testament. I don't know if you remember, on the Old Testament we talked about inspiration and we talked about inerrancy. And inspiration says that God influenced the creation of the biblical writings. But there's two ways to think about or to conceive of how inspiration occurred. You can either think that God dictated the words of a book to a biblical author, or you could think that the biblical author simply wrote the book, but as he was writing it, on occasion God would prompt him with a certain idea, or perhaps cause him to pick a certain word rather than a different word, that sort of thing, so that the influence was subtle. Just as real, but God didn't dictate every word. He influenced the author as needed. The Catholic Church tends to adopt the subtle theory, and conservative Protestants tend to adopt the dictation theory. Whichever one you adopt is going to have a major impact on how you understand the Bible to be free of error. The technical name for that doctrine is inerrancy. And the Catholic Church, just like Protestants, teach that the Bible is without error. But we mean rather different things when we say that. A conservative Protestant believing in the dictation theory who says that the Bible is without error means every single sentence is exactly how it happened. That is a theory of inerrancy called fundamentalism. Fundamentalism says every sentence is exactly how it happened. It says 7 days of creation, by gosh, it was 7 24-hour periods, etc., etc. Catholicism, just as it has a subtle theory of inspiration, also has a subtle theory of inerrancy. We as Catholics do not feel bound to maintain that every single sentence is exactly how it happened. Instead, what we say is what was beautifully said at Vatican Council II concerning inerrancy, and that was, and I quote, Scripture teaches without error that truth God wanted to put into the sacred writings for the sake of our salvation. Scripture teaches without error that truth God wanted to put into the sacred writings for the sake of our salvation. Well, that doesn't mean that every single sentence is exactly what happened. The Bible does teach some truths without error, but the truths that it teaches without error are the ones that God wanted there for the sake of our salvation. Is it crucial to your salvation whether, as in Genesis chapter 1, plants preceded humans, or as in Genesis chapter 2, humans and then plants? No, it's not crucial to your salvation. Is it crucial to your salvation whether the Last Supper was on Thursday, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke say, or Wednesday, as John said? No, it's not crucial to your salvation. We could go on with other contradictions. There are lots of contradictions in the Bible. But none of them are crucial to our salvation. What the Bible does teach without error are the truths crucial to our salvation. For example, Jesus' resurrection. That is absolutely crucial to our salvation. If Jesus didn't resurrect, Christianity would collapse like a house of cards. That's fundamental. How about monotheism? The creation accounts may differ as to the order in which things were created, but both it was certain that there was only one God. You can compare that with all the other ancient Near East where you got a committee that was just in the world. Maybe that would better explain why the world was the way it is. So this is how Catholicism handles the question that you raised. No, it's not crucial to our salvation, whether it was in a manger, whether it was in a cave, etc. Maybe what is crucial is the virgin birth, which is never contradicted, and so on. Okay, back to the synoptic problem. Various solutions to the synoptic problem. What was the synoptic problem? Why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar and yet so different? Various explanations of why they're the way they are were proposed. One of them was an understanding of the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke that had been around for centuries. This was the understanding of their relationship that you find in St. Augustine. St. Augustine wrote a book, De Cum Sensu Evangelicarum, back in around 400 AD. And in it, he said, this has become known as the Augustinian Hypothesis. He said, Matthew was the first of the three to write a gospel. Mark, when he wrote his gospel, had a copy of Matthew right there in front of him. Mark is only about 2/3 of the length of Matthew, so Augustine said, Mark compressed Matthew's gospel. And Augustine said, Luke, when he wrote his gospel, had a copy of Mark in front of him. Luke is considerably longer, almost twice as long as Mark, so he added in some things that Mark left out. That was Augustine's explanation for how the three Gospels are related to one another. It's exactly the order that they're in the New Testament today. Matthew wrote first, Mark had a copy of Matthew, Luke had a copy of Mark. Luke did not have a copy of Matthew. He simply had a copy of Mark. So similarities between Matthew and Luke are to be explained because Mark is the common term between them. We'll get to that. Exactly, yeah. There are other proposals that were made. Another proposal was called the grease-pot hypothesis. This is named after that guy who published the synopsis back in 1778. His name was Grease-pot, G-R-I-E-S-P-A-C-H. And he had his own theory after having spent a number of years examining the synopsis that he published. He said, yeah, it's true, Matthew wrote first, but Luke had a copy of Matthew. That explains why there are certain passages Matthew and Luke had together. And Mark didn't just have a copy of Matthew. Mark also had a copy of Luke. He used both of those Gospels in front of him as he compiled his Gospel. That was another theory to explain the relationship between the three synoptic Gospels. Why are they so similar? Well, Luke had Matthew, Mark had Luke and Matthew. Why are they so different? Well, different reasons for leaving out certain things, rearranging certain things, and so on. There were probably a couple of dozen proposals that were put forward as explanations for how the Synoptic Gospels wound up being the way they are today. Virtually all of these proposals have died out as having any supporters, except for three. There are three hypotheses that still have supporters today. You still find a few scholars who support the Augustinian hypothesis. You have a few more who support the grease-pot hypothesis. But most scholars today have opted for what is called the four-source theory. Let me move this podium so everyone can see. The four-source theory says it was not Matthew who wrote first. The evangelist who wrote first was Mark. And Matthew and Luke had copies of Mark. Each had a copy of Mark in front of him as he wrote his stuff. That's an important suggestion, but it doesn't cover all of the evidence if you stop there. If you compare the Gospels alongside one another, the way that they're printed in a synopsis, here's Matthew, here's Mark, here's Luke, you're going to find some passages that are in all three of the Gospels. An example would be the healing of the paralytic. That appears in all three of the Gospels. Or the feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 5,000 appears in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. But there are other patterns that appear. Sometimes you'll get a passage that only appears in Matthew and Mark, or only appears in Mark and Luke. One of the non-Markan Gospels will skip a certain passage. Again, sometimes you'll find a passage that only appears in Matthew and Luke, and not in Mark. And then again, you can have passages that only appear in one Gospel. Sometimes you'll have a passage that's only in Matthew, or sometimes you'll have a passage that's only in Mark, or sometimes you'll have a passage that's only in Luke. I believe, you mathematicians can check me on this, if you've only got 3 numbers, then there's only 7 possible combinations. It's either in all 3, it's either in 2, which gives you 3 possibilities, or it's in 1 only, and there's only 3 possibilities. So a total of 7, right? This is it. Every single passage in the Gospels is either in all 3, only in 2, or in only 1 of them. So there's all the possible combinations. If you stop here, Matthew and Luke both had Mark, well, that would certainly explain these passages. Why is it that the healing of the paralytic is in all 3 Gospels? Well, because Matthew and Luke got it from Mark. So you can explain that pattern. You can explain instances of passages in all 3 Gospels according to the hypothesis that Mark wrote first. What about this? Can you explain this? Well, yeah, you could argue Matthew has it because he saw it in Mark, and Luke, for whatever reason, chose not to include it. Or vice versa. Luke has it in his gospel because he had Mark in front of him, and Matthew, for some reason, chose not to include it. So we could explain these patterns according to this idea. Matthew and Luke had Mark. Well, what about this? There are passages that are found only in Matthew and Luke and do not appear in Mark. Can we explain those on the assumption that Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them and that's where they got it? Obviously not. It's not in Mark. So we need to supplement this idea that Matthew and Luke had Mark. They must have had some other source also. Let me list a couple of passages for you that appear only in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. Consequently, they're in Matthew and Luke and nowhere else in the entire Bible. Lord's Prayer. Lord's Prayer appears in Matthew and Luke, not in Mark or Luke. The Beatitudes. The Beatitudes appear in Matthew and Luke. Nowhere else. Sermon on the Mount. Judge not, love your enemies, all of that. That's in Matthew and that's in Luke. It does not appear anywhere else. How are we to explain why these passages appear in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark? That might work, except then you have the problem that Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount is 3 chapters long and Luke's is half a chapter long. So either Matthew added a bunch or Luke left out a bunch. Then you get into the problem. He was suggesting maybe those 2 were at the sermon and Mark wasn't, but there's got to be more to it than just that. Oh, it's a good suggestion. Well, one thing you notice when you look at these passages that are only in Matthew and Luke and nowhere else is they're all sayings. There aren't any episodes. There aren't any events. There aren't any doings of Jesus that are recorded only in Matthew and Luke and not in some of the Gospels. Now, there's one exception to that: the healing of the centurion's servant, which is found in Luke 7 and wherever in Matthew. There is one miracle. that appears in Matthew and Luke and nowhere else. But that is a talking miracle. The purpose of the miracle is not to show Jesus doing miracles. It's to provide an occasion for Jesus to talk about faith and the importance of faith. So even there is a passage in which the sayings are what's important. So, of all of these passages, and there's 40 or 50 passages that appear only in Matthew and Luke and nowhere else. I only mentioned 3. They're all sayings. Now that's one thing to keep in mind as we try to figure out where did these passages come from. Another thing to remember is that the wording is identical in many instances. Let's take a look at that. I notice you have a Bible with you. You've got New American Bible, and you have New American Bible. Would you look up Luke chapter 6, verses 40, 41, 42, right in there. And you want Matthew chapter 6. Does yours have little headings to the paragraphs? Look for the parable of the speck of the log, or the mote in the beam, or something like that. You want Luke chapter 6. Yeah. Right there, 41. You want 41 and 42. Luke 7, 41 and 42. Luke 6, 41 and 42. Did you find it? It's not 5. It's in either 6 or 7. Parable of the speck of the log. Splinter will work, yeah. Look at it. Now, where is that? It's what? Chapter 6, verse 41. Okay. Now wait, you're in Luke, right? I'm after Matthew. Yeah. Matthew 7:3. Okay. What we're going to do is compare Matthew's version and Luke's version of this same parable. And so what I'm going to ask her to do, you've got the Matthew. Read a few words, like the first clause, until you come to a comma or something like that, or a natural pause. And then pause, and then I'm going to ask you to read the equivalent set of words from Luke. And then we'll go back to you and get the next set of words, and then hear what Luke says, and we'll vary back and forth this way until we go through both verses. Why do you say, or however it starts? No, go down to where it starts.
Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye?
Stop. Okay, why do you know the splinter that is in? Why do you notice the splinter that is in your brother's eye? Okay.
But do not see the splinter in your eye.
Okay.
How can you say to your brother? That you use that splinter in your eye?
There is a slight, that's good enough. There is a slight difference. Toward the end, yours said brother, comma, lefty, and yours just said lefty. And yours said something about what you notice, and yours just simply said, well, it's the left. But those are very tiny. If you look at the original Greek of these two passages, you'll find that we've got a sequence of maybe 45 or 50 words which are virtually identical in the two Gospels. I think this is significant because one possibility would be, hey, maybe Matthew went to his church and people at his church taught him that Jesus at one point said this parable. And Luke in some other city went to his church and people at his church taught him Jesus at some point told this parable about the second think that's possible, because if that were what had happened, then there would be much more difference between the two accounts than there is. The fact that these wordings are identical indicates that Matthew and Luke had some kind of written document in front of them. Did you ever play that game called telephone or telegraph? Remember how that goes? What you do is, well, let's just try it. I'll just read it. I think of something to say, and I say it to him, and he repeats it, whispering to him, to her, to her. Let's just try it real quick. Let's see what happens. It's real quiet because they're trying to We can stop. By the time we got back to that corner, okay, let's see what you heard. What do you think she said?
Why children like pizza without alcohol?
Why children like pizza without alcohol? And what did I originally say? I said my children like pizza with pepperoni, but no anchovies or green olives. If a saying that I made got changed that much in 3 minutes, how much would Jesus' sayings wind up being altered over the course of 3 or 4 decades, which is probably the distance between Jesus originally saying the second law of parable and Matthew and Luke hearing it from members of their churches or whatever. So I don't think it's possible that Matthew and Luke both picked this stuff up out of the air as oral traditions. I think there has to be some kind of written document that they both have. Unfortunately, we don't have any written document from back at the time of the Gospels that contains a collection of sayings. But there must have existed such a document. Since we don't know the name of it, we can't call it Gospel of Acts or something of Y. We simply give it the name Q. Why did they name it Q? Well, you know that guy in Star Trek Next Generation. No. Because it was German scholars who first noticed this source for Matthew and Luke, and the German word for source is Quelle, Quelle. That German word Quelle is where we get the English word well. You know, a well is a source of water. So they simply shortened it to the first letter, Q, and everybody's used that as an abbreviation since then. So we can now modify our chart here. Not only do we hypothesize that Matthew and Luke had Mark, we also believe Matthew and Luke must have had some other written source. How do we know it's written? Because I just forwarded it. And what was it like? It was just a collection of sayings. That's interesting. Somebody around 50 BC, probably, 50 AD probably, collected all of Jesus' sayings, or a bunch of them. And that source was available to Matthew and to Luke when they wrote their Gospels. Apparently it wasn't available to Mark when he wrote his. Well, that leaves us with these three patterns to be explained. An example of a passage that appears only in Matthew is Matthew's Christmas story, which is 2 chapters long. Remember all that stuff we have? That's all Matthew only. And similarly, Luke's Christmas stories, infancy narratives, chapters 1 and 2, are Luke only. There are other examples. Remember that parable about the laborers in the vineyard? There was a farmer who needed guys to work on his farm. So he went out at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 a.m., and 5 and hired people. Then he paid everybody off at 7 o'clock and gave them all the same wage. The guys who'd been working for 11 hours were angry. That's called the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. That's only in Matthew. Nowhere else. That's a Matthew only passage. You want an example of a passage that appears only in Luke? Prodigal son. How about that? Probably the most important of all the parables. And it's only in Luke's gospel. Not in Matthew, not in Mark, not in John. How are we to explain these patterns? Well, this one's no problem. Right? Passages that appear in Mark only, we can explain them similar to what we did these up here. They appeared in Mark, but this time neither Matthew nor Luke chose to include it. So they did have Mark in front of them. They just both simultaneously, probably for similar reasons, opted not to include a certain passage. So that we can explain according to the belief that Matthew and Luke had Mark. What we can't explain with the idea that Matthew and Luke had Mark is where Matthew got these. He didn't get them from Mark. They're not in Mark. They're only in Matthew. Or where Luke got these. He didn't get them from Mark. Nor can we explain that they came from Q. Occasionally you might be able to say, well, something that's in Matthew only might have been in Q. Remember, Q by definition is passages only in Matthew and Luke. And it was in Q, and Matthew kept it, and Luke chose not to include it. That's a possibility, I suppose. Or similarly, you could argue that something in Luke, prodigal son, was in Q, and therefore available to Matthew, but he chose not to include it. But that's not likely. And there's so many passages only in Matthew, and so many passages only in Luke, that it's very difficult to hypothesize that you can explain all of these on the basis of Q, and that one or the other chose not to include a certain Q passage. Consequently, we have to hypothesize 2 more additional sources, besides Mark and Q, for Matthew and Luke. One of them was a source of information about Jesus that only Matthew was privy to. We have no idea what it was like. Was it oral traditions that he heard in his church? Or was it a written document? We can't know. Because unlike Q, we can't compare passages and see if they have identical roots. These are passages that only occur in Matthew. So it could be oral traditions, could be a written document of some kind that only Matthew had. Whatever. And again, we don't have a name for it, so what we're going to do is we'll just assign it the letter M. We'll say that there was a source, M, from whence Matthew got certain information that nobody else has. And similarly, there was a source, L. We don't know anything about it. Could have been oral things that Luke heard, or it could have been a written document, who knows. But this could explain where Luke got the information that only appeared in Luke's stuff. Either way, we need to hypothesize a 3rd and 4th source to explain Matthew and Luke in their present shape. So how do we modify our chart? Well, Matthew, in addition to Mark and Q, also had M. And Luke, in addition to Mark, and Q also had L. And now we got everything covered. You yourself said that mathematically this is every possible combination. And we explained every single combination by means of four sources for Matthew and Luke, namely M, Q, Mark, and L. Voila, the four-source theory. The four sources are along the top here and include one of the synoptics. And they feed into the other two, the big synoptic, the long synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke. If I had to put percentages on it, my guess was, this is very rough estimate, but from my reading, I would guess you got maybe 3% of New Testament scholars who would still opt for the Augustinian hypothesis. Almost nobody does anymore. And usually, if they do so because it was tradition for 1,800 years, and they don't want to give up on that. Three-spot hypothesis may have, let's say, 7% of scholars. That was the one that said Matthew wrote first, Luke had Matthew, and Mark had both Matthew and Luke. And that leaves about 90% of scholars who opt for the four-source theory. Yeah. That might occur to some extent, but if you go through and look at the number of Q passages, for example, can we assume that Mark left out the Lord's Prayer because of his Q? Do you think leaving out the Lord's Prayer would have helped in the Gentiles to be good? Or sticking it in? Either way.
Very, very important for us now. I just want to know that it's right. I think it's not very much because they feel it was important. To
answer your last question, did they know each other was writing? There's no evidence whatsoever that they did, and there's some evidence that they didn't. So, certainly Matthew and Luke knew about Mark. They had it in front of them, according to this theory. But there's no evidence, and some reason to believe that neither Matthew nor Luke knew of the other's gospel. And they were written pretty close to at the same time. Presumably in different cities, we don't know where. You're raising excellent questions, and I love it that you're thinking about this. Let me just give you a quick demonstration of what you're talking about with these different audiences. Here's a parable of the two houses, that appears in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, and also in Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. What source is this from? It's from Matthew 7 and Luke 6. It's a Q passage. True, good, thanks. All right, now here's Matthew 7. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and sets them and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the flood came, the winds blew and beat upon the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. That's Matthew's version. Here's Luke's. Yeah. Starting in verse 7. I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundations on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against the house, but did not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. Essentially it's the same, right? But I see two major differences between them. One difference is, Matthew says that the one house was built on rock, and the other house was built on sand. It also says that there was rain, which resulted in a flood. In Luke's version, it says he dug a foundation in order to build on rock. Whereas the foolish builder did not build a foundation, but simply built on the surface. Also, in Luke's version, it doesn't say anything about rain resulting in a flood. It simply says a flood arose. Well, Matthew's version is rather neatly the environment that you find in Palestine. Because in Palestine, you have the Mediterranean Sea, you have a ridge of mountains following the coast, Jerusalem is up in there, and then you have a low depression with the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. Clouds come in from the Mediterranean bearing water. They hit the mountains and drop their load of rain, and these rains cause flash floods to occur in what are normally dry street beds, stream beds. These are called wadis. But every once in a while, these wadis will suddenly have a flash flood in them. Consequently, this suggests Palestinian environment, because even today, Palestinians don't build basements. They simply build on the surface. They're like Houstonians. And we have trouble with flash floods, I've heard. When I moved here from Wisconsin 9 years ago, I was surprised that I didn't get a basement. Because I was used to sticking all my stuff in the basement. Now it's all up over my head. That's because Wisconsin is more like the environment that Luke had in mind when he told his version of the parable. What he is hypothesizing is the sort of building practices that you find in Greece and Rome. In addition to which, in Italy, you certainly have floods. The Po River will suddenly flood in Rome, but there's no rain involved because the clouds have gone way up north, hit the Alps, dump their load, and then the flood 2 days later suddenly shows up at your doorstep. So it seems to me the Matthean version of this parable fits a Palestinian background, and the Lucan version of the parable fits a Greco-Roman background. Now, why is that? Well, I'm assuming that what you're talking about is what caused this. Chances are, Luke, or whomever he got this from, wanted to adjust it to a Gentile audience, and they're used to basements and civilized behavior. Matthew's version is probably closer to what Jesus would actually have said, wouldn't you think? Since Jesus was initially talking to fellow Palestinians, he's more likely to have reflected Palestinian background. So I don't deny that adjustment to one's audience certainly has affected the traditions as they appear in the Gospels nowadays. But I don't think that that's a sufficient explanation to explain all of these thousands of details that have to be explained when we compare the Gospels closely. It's part of it, but not a complete solution. We've gone a bit past our normal time to break. Can we take a break? And as soon as we come back, I want to get your questions. I want to forget. Thank you.